Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, is there any chance that Naz Reid's role changes this year in light of his new contract? We'll evaluate that. Plus, Jaden McDaniels, what are his best lineups and what ultimately could the Wolves front court rotation look like? It's all upcoming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend. Hopefully you've had a fantastic week so far. A few things to get to today. I want to talk a bit about the Timberwolves front court. Obviously, Naz Reid getting a contract extension this offseason. I want to talk about could his role shift at all? What have the front court rotations looked like to date between Naz? We've seen a little bit more Naz at center and Jaden at the four, partly due to necessity last year when Rudy Gobert and Julius Randle dealt with injuries. So I want to evaluate what those lineups looked like. And if they told us anything about what those lineups might look like this year, if there's any chance that the when healthy rotation changes at all, that Chris Finch makes any tweaks there. So I want to break that down today in light of last year's lineup data, really. And then I also want to talk a bit toward the end about the Locked On NBA 100, top 100 players. I'm submitting my list today, and I made a couple of tweaks since I talked about it a couple weeks ago on the show. So I want to talk about that on today's show as well. Before we get started, though, big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. Okay, let's talk Naz Reid. So the reason why this was on my radar to really kind of dig into is I recorded, actually, I think maybe publishing today. I recorded with Josh Lloyd of Locked On Fantasy Basketball, definitely the best fantasy basketball show in the world, really. Josh, of course, is in Australia, and the internet goes everywhere, though. So really in the world, regardless of where Josh is from, but it truly is an international podcast. Josh does a fantastic job. We recorded an entire show about the Timberwolves, and we spent the first segment talking about Naz Reid. We spent the second segment talking about Philly Nickeil Alexander-Walker's role, which, of course, I've talked about a lot on this show. And, of course, I told him I think ultimately TJ Shannon soaks up most of those minutes, but there's a shot for Rob Dillingham if the Wolves end up wanting more of a ball handler. And those are really the guys we talked about. And then he asked me about Jaden McDaniels to close the show. And so that got me thinking a little bit more about the Timberwolves front court. He asked me a couple of interesting questions about the minutes fluctuation for both Naz and Jaden that was tied to that period of time in February, March, where some combination of Rudy Gobert and Julius Randle was out basically that whole time. And they, of course, both saw their minutes go up dramatically. They both saw their production go up dramatically. But then when the team got healthy, we saw Jaden's minutes come down and also his production come down. Naz's minutes came down, but he wasn't necessarily less effective. In fact, Josh brought up an interesting stat that Naz Reid actually shot the three ball much better off the bench than he did as a starter, which I think that's more fluky than anything else. Maybe it has to do with the personnel he was on the floor with. I'd be willing to bet he was shooting more off the dribble as a member of the starting lineup than he did off the bench. I think off the bench, he there was a little bit less pressure to create necessarily, or I guess in that case. And I mean, Naz still, I think he started 18 games last year. So, all that to say, what I want to do is it got me thinking about the Wolves' actual front court rotation. And in light of Naz's deal, I mean, he's under contract now for 5 years, $21 million this year's a bargain, but it obviously goes up each year. And if you take out those starts, he wouldn't have ended up playing necessarily any more last season than he did the year before. He played in 80 games. He started 17, and he averaged 27.5 minutes per game. So his minutes per game was up 3.3 minutes. But Josh pointed out on the show that his minutes per game as a starter is like, I don't know, 35, 36, 37, something like that. but off the bench, it was much more in the 22 to 24 range. I don't remember what it was exactly, but I think it was actually less than his overall minutes per game the year prior when he started 14 games for the Wolves. So I started trying to think through. He was basically asking me from a fantasy perspective, would Naz Reid, get any more run? Is there any more upside there? And my answer was, I think slightly yes. And the reason why is I do think Minnesota is starting to think about, obviously they've been thinking about, but from a coaching standpoint, not just the front office, they're going to have to start to think about life beyond Rudy Gobert. Rudy's still got 2 years in a player option. He's very likely on this team for another 3 years. But I think we've started to see a little bit of aging with Rudy. And I think Minnesota drafting John Beringer isn't, so much can happen in 3 years. I don't think that's like directly the plan, but in a perfect world, it is, right? In a perfect world, when Beringer is 21, 22, he's now your starting center. And before then, at some point, he becomes your main backup center. But now you've also got Naz Reid in the fold. I think the Beringer thing is an acknowledgement of, hey, look, the league's changing, we're evolving. Well, he's still a massive human. He's not exactly the size of Rudy Gobert. He's more, in terms of strength. He's also more mobile than Rudy, obviously much younger. Could the Wolves look at changing up what they're doing defensively, what that overall schematic looks like? Shout out JJ Redick, word schematic. I think yes. I think that's part of it. I think that they're starting to look at that. And so I also think there was some intriguing things about Naz Reid playing the small ball 5, which I do want to get into today. I think I'll save that for when I start talking a little bit more about Jaden, because often Jaden was at the 4 when Naz was at the 5. So the first thing I want to point out is that Naz Reid was better at the 4. He was better playing next to Rudy Gobert at the 4. And so I'm gonna cite some of those numbers because in a big piece of this is, of course, Rudy's fantastic defensively, but overall, Naz and Rudy on the floor together were a 96th percentile unit, according to Cleaning the Glass. They were plus 13 on the season. They were 99th percentile defensively. They were only 66th percentile offensively, but that's still very good. And again, overall, they were plus 13. Their top 4 most used lineups were all a plus 10.5 or better. All a plus 10.5 or better. 3 of the 4 of them had Anthony Edwards. 3 of the 4 of them had Dante DiVincenzo. And then actually their fifth most used lineup was not very good, but then like 4 of the next 5 were all at least a plus 10 or better. So another way to say that would be 8 of the 10 most used lineups with Naz Reid and Rudy Gobert on the floor together were 8 of the 10 were positive, and all of those were plus 10.5 or better, which is pretty incredible. So, of course, when Julius Randle was out, there was a version of that was the starting lineup with Conley, Edwards, McDaniels, Naz, and Gobert. That, by the way, was a 95th percentile unit, was a plus 29.4 differential and 221 possessions, which isn't a massive amount, but it's also not nothing, 221 possessions. So, I guess the short version, again, Naz better with Gobert. He's better at the 4. And I don't want to get too deep into the Julius thing today. I'm more talking about Naz and Gobert and Naz's role, but I guess it's worth citing the Julius numbers. So I'll say this again. So Rudy and Naz together were plus 13, a 96th percentile overall unit with the defense at 99th percentile. Rudy and Julius together were only a plus 4.7, 76th percentile unit. Still good defensively, 83rd percentile, and just 58th percentile on offense. They were worse on both ends of the floor. And a lot of the Julius Randle on-off stuff isn't great. If you dig into that, the Timberwolves were generally better with Julius Randle off the court than they were with him on the court, which is another thing to keep in mind when we're talking about Naz Reid's role. I do not think the Timberwolves extended both Julius Randle and Naz Reid to give Naz Julius's role. But Julius Randle's contract is shorter. Julius Randle, the idea of them getting off of Julius Randle, I talked about this, I think, on Wednesday's show, the flexibility and the optionality that was built into this roster. Julius Randle only has one more guaranteed year after this coming year. So they'll undoubtedly play this year with Julius Randle. If things go completely haywire, they could deal him at the deadline. He's only got 1+1 left, 1 year in a player option after this. He's still only 31. If they're like 5 games below 500, God forbid, they could trade Julius Randle at the deadline and be like, all right, Naz, you're the starting 4 now. And Naz and Rudy together are better than Julius Randle and Rudy. And certainly better than Julius Randle and Naz, because those lineups were not nearly as good defensively. Now, so the Gobert's contract is the same, but I think they would trade Julius Randle before Rudy Gobert at this point. And I know Rudy was in potential trade discussions for Kevin Durant and everything, but I think in a perfect world, they'd rather trade. And when you're trading, I mean perfect world. Like, the Wolves aren't planning to trade these guys. They didn't sign them to trade them, but they have the options in case they need to. So I think that's something to keep in mind when it comes to the Rudy Julius lineup and the different pivots that Minnesota then could have. What I want to dig into next is the idea of Naz playing small ball 5 and what that has looked like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull Rudy and Jaden together with no Rudy Gobert, which then gives us Jaden at the 4 and sorry, I said Rudy. Naz and Jaden on the floor together with Rudy off the floor, which gives us Naz at the 5 and Jaden at the 4 and Gobert off the floor. So I want to dig into those numbers, and they weren't great, but there's also a couple of other kind of sub lineups there that I want to look at and try and decipher if this is something that Chris Finch is going to try and do this year. So we'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at OpenPhone. If you're running a business, you know that every missed call is money left on the table. Think about the last time you had an urgent need, maybe for a plumber or a service provider. If the first person didn't answer, did you wait? Probably not. You moved on, and that's why you need OpenPhone. OpenPhone is the #1 business phone system built to streamline and scale your customer communications, all from an app on your phone or computer. OpenPhone lets me manage business calls and texts from a single app. The shared inbox feature is a game changer. Your team can jump into any conversation instantly without missing a beat. Plus, their AI agent handles after-hours calls, answers common questions, and captures leads so that you never miss a customer. OpenPhone is offering my listeners 20% off your first 6 months at openphone.com/LockedOnNBA. That's OpenPhone, OpenPhone.com/LockedOnNBA. If you have existing numbers with another service, OpenPhone will port them over at no extra charge. OpenPhone, no missed calls, no missed customers. Okay, let's talk about small ball Naz at the 5. And also the side note here is Jaden himself is this year, his minutes were better when he played the 4, and he did that for an extended period of time, much more than he did the previous couple of years. Tim Connolly, Chris Finch preferred to play bigger, but out of necessity when they had injuries, Jaden played a lot more at the 4. It also coincided with when not only was he playing more of his minutes at the 4, he was just playing more overall minutes because of the injuries, and they had to rely on Jaden to do more. And that coincided with him playing really well. And that's something else that Josh Lloyd and I talked about on Locked On Fantasy is how well Jaden played when he was given the opportunity kind of in that middle portion of the season. It obviously went away a little bit down the stretch, but when he was given more opportunity, he played better. Now, Naz at the 5, Jaden at the 4 themselves was palatable. It was nowhere near as good as the plus 16 or whatever it was that I mentioned earlier when Naz was on the floor with Rudy. When Naz and Jaden were on the floor without Rudy, it was a 69th percentile unit, which is still fine, but it was just a plus 3.2. Defensively, no Rudy on the floor, was only a 54th percentile unit, so just better than the league median. 75th percentile on offense, so predictably very good on offense. And I also wanted to point out that some of these lineups have Julius Randle in them, and some don't. Like, some are not straight up Jaden at the 4, but Jaden and Julius Randle. So technically Julius Randle's playing the 4, Jaden's playing the 3. But again, the point I want to get at is Naz at the 5. So drilling down further, Naz at the 5 with Jaden at the 3 and Randle at the 4. So leaving Randle in the equation, the 3 most used lineups had Randle at the 4, and they were all negative lineups. Minus 8.9, minus 0.6, minus 8.3. And all three of those had Anthony Edwards and some combination of either Dante DiVincenzo, Mike Conley, and Nickeil Alexander-Walker. But the front court of Jaden, Julius, and Naz was not good last year. And then you get into some of the lineups that didn't include Julius Randle and truly did have Jaden at the 4. And again, like I said a minute ago, Jaden McDaniels' numbers at the 4 were better last year. There's a lineup that was Ant, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Jalen Clark, Jaden McDaniels, Naz Reid. Only 76 possessions, but it was a plus 20, plus 19.8. And it was good defensively too, which isn't surprising with Nickeil, Jalen Clark, and Jaden McDaniels all on the floor with Anthony Edwards too. But small ball Naz, I think you got to take it a layer further. So, like, if I add the filter on cleaning the glass and I take out Julius Randle and I say no Rudy, no Julius, this is truly Naz at the 5 and Jaden at the 4, the numbers improve. It's a much smaller sample. It's only 579 possessions for the season. So none of those lineups in and of themselves had 100 more possessions. But in those 579 total possessions, they were an 81st percentile and 84th percentile on defense. Just 110.6 points per 100 possessions. These are all lineups with no Rudy Gobert, and they were good defensively. Naz at the 5, Jaden at the 4, and some combination of these guys at the 1, 2, and 3. Those were good lineups. So it's not necessarily Naz at the 5. And predictably, the biggest struggle with those lineups was rebounding. Defensive rebounding was actually okay. Offensive rebounding was basically non-existent with Julius and Rudy off the floor. But the point that I want to make is Naz at the 5 and Jaden at the 4 together actually was pretty good. It was more the mixing and matching when Julius Randle got involved. And I'm not trying to spend the show dragging Julius Randle. The Wolves re-signed him for a reason. They need his playmaking. That, just because the on-off isn't good doesn't mean he's perpetually unplayable. It just means you got to pick your spots, right? You have to figure out what lineups are best for Julius Randle. And maybe I should spend another show on that. But because obviously the Wolves were a good team last year on both ends of the floor. They ended up going to the conference finals. But I also think early in the season, it took until late in the season before they did figure out how Julius Randle was best used with the ball in his hands. The injury didn't help in terms of, trying to figure stuff out on the fly. But Julius Randle is still obviously an effective player if the Wolves could pick the lineups that he's part of. Naz next to Rudy was very effective. Naz and Jaden in the front court with Rudy and Julius on the floor was also effective. Julius is the one that is a little bit of the wrench thrown in the plans, but the upside of what he can do from a playmaking standpoint, and obviously we saw what he could do in the first 2 rounds of the playoffs when he really does get hot, is still there, and it's very real. But I guess this brings me to, could the front court rotation change at all? I told Josh Lloyd I thought there was a chance it could, just because of what I said in the first segment today, which is, planning for life after Rudy, trying to take some miles off Rudy, which the Wolves have been very open about trying to do with Mike Conley, but they didn't try and do it with Rudy Gobert last year. I mean, like, Rudy did not play significantly less last season. They've got to start to think about what that looks like for Rudy Gobert over the next 2 to 3 years. Rudy played 33 minutes a game, down slightly, 33.2 to be exact, down from 34.1 the year before. So 0.9 less minutes per game. I think we continue to see that slight trend. I think it goes to 32, 31 minutes a game, which is, by the way, what he played most years in Utah. I mean, last year in Utah, he was 32 a game. Second to last year in Utah, he was 31 a game. He was 33 a game last year. That's still a lot for a guy who's 32. Rudy just turned 33 this summer, by the way, right at the end of June. So he's 33. I think you got to dial those minutes back to 31-ish a game, which gives a little more opportunity for Naz to play at the 5. Because, again, they don't have another center. They're not going to give Burns J. They're obviously not going to give Rocco Zakarsky, front court minutes in the rotation. So those are your bigs. And they may still add one big. I think they will. It's something we've talked about a lot on the show. But if they're going to protect Rudy at all, start to scale back those minutes, and at the same time plan for life after Gobert, then that means Naz at the 5, which was better than what I would have thought before I dug into the numbers. And specifically better with Jaden at the 4 in a smaller lineup, which I think is even more palatable with TJ Shannon, and the TJ Shannon at the 3 minutes with those two weren't actually all that great. But I think we saw Shannon get a lot better as the year went on, obviously into the playoffs. Summer League looked good. So I think there's some upside there with Shannon at the 3. You maintain athleticism, length. If he could do a reasonable facsimile of Nickeil Alexander-Walker defensively, which I think is on the table, then Naz at the 5, Jaden at the 4 is a very interesting front court. And I should say, on the Shannon note, if Minnesota wants to find minutes for TJ Shannon, that's another way to do it, is to play him with Jaden at the 4. So that way, you're not losing minutes for Jaden. You're still spelling Rudy. You could also do that same lineup, by the way, with Rudy on the floor and Naz on the bench. I mean, that's something else you could do. I think, that would be a much more defensive-minded lineup with Rudy instead of Naz. And then you've also got Jaden McDaniels and TJ Shannon. I mean, last year, lineups with Gobert and McDaniels at the 4 it was only 307 possessions, but it was not good. It was a minus 9.4 differential net rating, which is 16th percentile. The top 2 most used lineups were positive, but basically all the rest of them were negative. So Chris Finch obviously going to play around with it a little bit more. But in my mind, there's a world in which you have this bench lineup that has the right combination of defense and offense. If you've got Jaden McDaniels and TJ Shannon and, Ant or whatever on the floor, they should be pretty good defensively. Even with Naz at the 5, you're just going to switch a bunch of stuff, and the rebounding may not be quite as good. Maybe you put Jalen Clark out there to help rebounding wise, and then you got to worry a little bit about defense. So maybe it's Clark and Ant in the backcourt. You have TJ Shannon at the 3, and your playmaking is a combination of Ant and Shannon because Randle's off the floor. So there's a lot of optionality, again, for Chris Finch. And I think it's pretty intriguing to look at some of these pairings. And I would expect the front court rotation to be just altered slightly to allow for more rest for Rudy, maybe a couple less minutes for Julius Randle, and a little bit more opportunity at the 5 for Naz and at the 4 for Jaden McDaniels as the Wolves start to prepare for life, playing a little bit more. It's not really small ball, but a little bit smaller than they do with Rudy Gobert on the floor. And again, Beringer is not a lot smaller, but the way he's going to play is going to be different than Rudy Gobert due to his advantage in terms of mobility. So I think that does factor into the long range plan, which sounds a little crazy, but it's something Minnesota has to consider. And I think it could impact the actual rotation this year. All right, I want to close with a couple notes on my submission for the Locked On NBA Top 100. We'll do that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors at FanDuel. Summer sports are in full swing. Maybe you're all about baseball under the lights. I know I am. I love watching baseball, golf on the green, or high-stakes soccer action. FanDuel is the best way to make every game even more exciting. You're already following the action. Why not make it a little more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned at the beach. I've been using FanDuel to track my favorite matchups. The app always keeps it fresh with new daily promotions and fun ways to bet. It is super easy to use, fast to pay out. It makes even regular season games feel like must-watch events. Maybe you're not a big baseball person or you like baseball, but it's not that intriguing to sit and watch a full game. Not every game in 162 seems that important. So maybe you have a same game parlay. You want to follow it all through the game, or maybe you just want to watch your bet ride into the 9th inning of an exciting baseball game. That makes it that much more intriguing. FanDuel will make it feel like you're part of the action. If you're new to FanDuel, new customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. All right. So the Locked On NBA Top 100 list, I don't actually know when it comes out. I talked about it maybe 2 weeks ago on the show, a week and a half ago. I had thought my submissions were due that week. They're actually due today. So I had a bit of time to think through it. I also got a little bit more information when I first went through this ranking. I did not include Jason Tatum or Tyrese Haliburton at all. I misunderstood the assignment, I guess. I thought they weren't supposed to be on the list. Turns out we are ranking them, but it's a tough thing to do because we're basically ranking what we think they'll be when they come back from their injury based on what we saw from them. Obviously, both having, basically career years and bringing their teams to Tatum's case to the conference finals before he got hurt. Halliburton's case to the finals before he got hurt in the final game. So it's a tough thing to do, and it's a little bit of a guess, much more so than anything else. I'm going to cruise through like the high points of my list because some of it is a little bit similar to what I did a week and a half ago. So if you missed it, this is all new. If you didn't, I'm going to tell you where I put Tatum and Haliburton and a couple of other small tweaks. I do have to say, I started this thing. I thought there would be 6 Wolves on here. I actually thought there would be 4 Wolves. There ended up being 6, and now I'm back down to 5 with the additions. Dante DiVincenzo just got bumped off the list. I really struggle with this. I think I have him at 101. And I'm a really, really like objective person. So, I'm struggling with my not making myself just put him at 100 because, hey, I cover the Wolves, but too much integrity to do that. I have him at 101 on my list. So I've got Jokic first, obviously. I've got SGA second, Giannis third, Luka fourth. I've got Ant 5. I think if I was doing this list 3 months ago, I would have had Jason Tatum 5. I just have a tough time doing that when the dude's going to miss most of, if not all of next year, and he may not be himself for a couple of years. And obviously, like, at this point in his career, he's got a better chance of coming back when, like, say, Kevin Durant tore his Achilles or, other guys like that. But I struggle to put him at 5 when he's not going to play probably the whole season. So I have Ant at 5. I have Steph Curry at 6. I have Jalen Brunson at 7, which is higher than I thought he would be on my list. Donovan Mitchell at 8, Anthony Davis 9. LeBron is at 10 still. Then I go Kawhi, Jason Tatum, and Tyrese Halliburton back-to-back. I struggle with justifying separating them because I was mostly just guessing on where I think they'll be. I have them slightly ahead of Kevin Durant, thinking through like, hey, if they were to come back this year, could they be better than Kevin Durant? I mean, Tyrese obviously isn't coming back this year. Jason Tatum maybe could toward the end of the year. But so it's a little bit of a 2-year out projection for those two because, like, even though this list is for this season, I'm essentially saying, hey, when they get back on the floor, could they be better than Kevin Durant? Well, that'll be 2 years from now, and Kevin Durant will be really old. So, yeah, I think they could be. Then I've got Evan Mobley, and obviously, could Mobley be better than Tatum and Halliburton? Yeah. Wemby is next. Yes. I've got Cat at 17 on the list. No other notables, no other Timberwolves players until I get down to where do I have Julius? There he is, 39. I have Julius Randle at 39, which is, before I submit it today, I may convince myself to slide him a little bit higher. I've got him at 39 currently, a spot ahead of Trae Young, a spot behind Draymond Green, which I go back and forth on since he ate Draymond's lunch in the playoffs. A couple spots behind Tyrese Maxey, who, of course, dealt with his own injury issues. Jamal Murray, same deal. Like, it's a tough range to try and figure out where to put Julius. But to my point earlier, the on-off stuff, like, I mean, there's still a lot of metrics and things that would suggest that Julius Randle's actual impact isn't as good as what it seems like it is. But then you turn around and see what he did in the playoffs, and it's like, all right, dude can carry a team a little bit. So I struggle. I don't think there's any way he shouldn't be in the top 40, and I'm sure some people will not have him in the top 40. I've got Rudy Gobert at 45. And by the way, this leads to another discussion that perhaps we'll do on a future show this offseason, which is second and third best players on the best teams in the West and in the East. Where do Julius and Rudy stack up? I mean, like, obviously SGA, like, I have Chet Holmgren at 31. So they're, and Jalen Williams at 25. So the Thunder have 3 of the top 31 players on my list. Timberwolves have 1 of the top 38. Like, Julius isn't on there till 39, and then Rudy's at 45. So they're both on there in the top 50. So 3 top 50 players is great, but a lot of teams on this list have 3 top 50 players. And you get a team like Denver. I mean, which maybe isn't surprising, but they've got Jokic at 1, they've got Murray at 36, and then I've got Aaron Gordon at 50. There's plenty of teams that only have 1 guy. There's some teams that have none in the top 50, right? Like, Jaws at 30. I mean, I guess like that's an example. Or I guess I've got Jaren Jackson on here too. Yeah. Okay. Well, that was a bad example. But Jaren Jackson Jr. is at 32 also. Next Wolves player, I'll skip down a little ways and maybe dig in this a bit more, compare my list to the big list once it gets released. I've got Jaden at 61, a spot ahead of Lou Dort because I couldn't help myself. 2 spots behind Amen Thompson, who I'm sure people will have higher than 59. I got to see it for more than a few weeks before he's higher than 59. Other Timberwolves players, I've got Naz at 77, and he's my last player on the list. And again, I had Dante at, I think he was at 99 before I added those 2 guys. I bumped him down to 101. Also just missing the cut, PJ Washington, who had previously been on my list, but had to bump him off. So, and I was like, all right, could I say DiVincenzo's better than Emmanuel Quickley? I'm factoring in the fact Quickley played 33 games this year, but when he's healthy, he's really good. Like, I think Emmanuel Quickley is probably, when he's healthy, like a top 50, 60 player. But I have him at 99 because I just don't know, staying on the court matters too. which is like, where do I have Zion on this list? Like, Zion is much lower than he really should be. I have Zion at 46, and I struggle with that one because, is 50 games of Zion better than, I don't know, 75 games of Lauri Markkanen? Like, which is better for your team, which is better in a vacuum, which is actually better on the court, and how do you weigh that? I think it's super challenging. And obviously, Markkanen was limited a bit by his situation last year being in Utah, but on their motivation to win kind of went up and down a bit, and mostly was down. So his minutes were affected by that. But all that to say, that's how I have my list lined out. I do not know when the big list comes out, so I probably won't talk about it until then. But then I will compare my list to the big list. We'll talk about where my fellow hosts got it right, where they got it wrong, and we'll see if there's a shot. If five Wolves should be on this list. Outside shot at 6. I think 5 will be on this list. So we'll make sure that that's the case here once this list comes out. All right, that's all I got for you today. Big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. No matter where you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV, as well as YouTube, of course. And you can also follow on X at Locked On T Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. And a reminder for your second listen this offseason, check out the Locked On NBA show. Our guys, Doug, Matt, and Hayes, do a fantastic job keeping you up to date on everything, all NBA this offseason. You can find Locked On NBA on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Of course, Locked On Wolves podcast is also part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast. We'll catch you next time.